So we're at the psychoeducation stage, so the very first stage of trying to help the family and the young person understand OCD. So we've already tried to give an understanding that thoughts which pop into your head are normal. You can't control them, they're just there. So the idea is that if they're there and we can't control them, let's learn to live with them and not be bothered by them. The other thing which we want to do at this stage is to help the child and the young person to understand that what is happening is not just random. Actually, it makes sense. And this is what we talk about in terms of a sort of formulation, the cognitive formulation. So I'm going to show you a video now of me talking with Russell, where we're going through some of the things we've talked about in an earlier session, and how we then tease that out into a formulation to help him understand where his OCD came from and what is maintaining it. So I'm going to hand over to Russell now on this video, and from my colleague who's doing the translation for us, they will read out, for those of you who are listening in Turkish, a summary of what we are talking about. I suppose the next thing which we did was to try to make some sense of all these different things. Because you came and you told me about lots of different things that have been happening, and I think around about our sort of second or third meeting, we tried to pull those together, and I don't know if you remember, we started to draw things up on the blackboard. Yeah. Because these things don't just suddenly happen, and your sense of being worried about Dad and his heart attack.
Chain reaction.
Yeah, there were things which had happened in the family, weren't there, which had started to make you worry about that. So this was our summary, and we wrote this up on the board and we changed it and we added things to it, and then at the end of it I sort of went away and I wrote it out.
This is the events and experiences that I've gone through in the last.
I don't understand what's happened there. I suppose the next thing which we did was to try to make some sense of all these different things. Sorry, I'm going to try again. I don't know why it jumped. You told me about lots of different things that have been happening, and I think around about our sort of second or third meeting, we tried to pull those together, and I don't know if you remember, we started to draw things up on the blackboard. Yeah. Because these things don't just suddenly happen, and your sense of being worried about Dad and his heart attack.
Chain reaction.
Yeah, there were things which had happened in the family, weren't there, which had started to make you worry about that. So this was our summary, and we wrote this up on the board and we changed it and we added things to it, and then at the end of it I sort of went away and I wrote it out.
This is the events and experiences that I've gone through in the last, must be 5 years, and it seems that. Okay, I'm sorry, I don't understand why the video is sort of jumping. So what we saw is just the start of the discussion which I was having with Russell. But I've summarized it here so that I can walk you through the things which we talked about and how we made history, how we made sense of everything for Russell. Now, there's different types of formulation that you can use, and this one is really just helping us to understand why is it that Russell is very worried about his father having a heart attack. So we look back at his past experiences. And when we looked
at what was happening in his family. There was a history of his family having heart attacks. I think that there was 3 people in the family who had a heart attack, 2 of which grandparents died from heart attacks. So there is an experience for Russell that people have heart attacks and die. And this led him to have this sort of fairly strong belief that bad things happen to my family. And he was particularly concerned about his father, because his father was older than his mother, and he was worried that his father was now of an age that he would have a heart attack and that he would die. So his experience led him to start to worry about this. The assumptions is, can I keep my family safe? And he then started to make the connection between doing habits, safety behaviors, and if he did those, then he would be able to keep his family safe. So this is what gets wired in Russell's head, and this gets triggered, so he starts to hear these thoughts at certain times. And in this instance, when Russell walks into his house, it's a very difficult time for him. So we've looked at a little bit of the history, where this has come from, and then what happens, Russell's vicious circle. So you'll be familiar with this from what we showed you earlier. So for Russell, when he enters the house, he gets these thoughts. Oh, I'm home. Oh, mum and dad. Oh, I'm worried, I'm scared that somebody is going to die. For him, that's a really scary thought. And it creates distress, anxiety, and he feels very frightened. The way he's learned to deal with this is through all his safety behaviors. Things 4 times, straightening, hand washing, all the different habits he's learned. They bring him temporary relief, but it wears off. And then he's back again. Have I done this right? Have I done enough checking? Will that be enough to keep Dad safe? So we then put this together for Russell so that he could see this as his vicious circle where his thoughts, how he felt, and his habits were linked. We also showed him why it is that he's worried about his father having a heart attack, because that's the experience he has had in his family, where a number of dear relatives had sadly died. Now, doing a formulation, it's not that I sat there and said, this is what I think is happening, Russell. We did this together. And I had questions about, well, what sort of thoughts happen for you when you walk in through the front door? So he tells me. How do you feel? So he tells me. What do you do? Well, I do all my habits. So he tells me. So the process is built up by us together. The difference is that I've got a framework where I'm putting all this together, which makes sense of it. And the power of a formulation, of making sense of it, is really powerful. So I'm going to try, there's another video showing you what Russell thought about the formulation when we finally agreed it. So fingers crossed, let's see if it works. I have in my mind you sitting there and saying, oh, that's amazing, I understand it now.
Yeah.
Can you remember that?
Because I always thought that these just came along.
Yeah.
And she said nothing just comes along. There's a chain reaction of events that actually trigger these things. And I was so relieved to have actually understood why this was happening, because I thought I was going insane and things were just happening to my mind. But I was extremely pleased that we actually pretty much found out why these things were happening.
Yes.
It was amazing.
And again, I remember you just being very, very relieved that as we sort of wrote it up on the board and you sat and said, yeah, that makes sense, that makes sense. And cool, yeah.
Yeah.
All stuck together.
Always, why didn't I see that myself? But I suppose that's why I'm not the psychologist.
So it was really interesting because when you can put it together to tell the story, the relief that Russell felt was really powerful. He thought that he was going mad, that he was insane. He had no control over his thoughts or why he was doing all these habits. But we could provide him with an understanding, provided immense relief. He then understood that the things which were happening to him were not random, they were connected. And as soon as we start to get that understanding, we are then led into, well, we can change this, can't we? Because if we understand that those thoughts create that distress, make you do those behaviors, we can start to change that so that you don't have to do these things and that you can start to feel better. So our formulation's really, really powerful, and I can't underestimate the strength of spending time here at the beginning to share with them what we know in terms of our models of CBT and how these things are linked, but we need to share that in an understandable way with young people. So the key messages which we try and get across during these initial meetings are that these obsessive thoughts, emotions, and behaviors are linked. Not random, not disconnected, they are linked. And that understanding this relationship now means we can experiment to do something to change what is happening. Now, something else which we need to try and understand at the earlier stages is actually increasing awareness about what happens during anxiety. And I showed you this picture earlier, but just to go through it again, what happens is that for children, people with OCD, they notice their anxiety starting to go up, but when it reaches this stage, they start to do their compulsions and the anxiety will dip down. What happens though, is the anxiety builds up again. As it goes up, they do their compulsions and it comes down. So they stay trapped in this triangle here. The fear is that if they don't do any of their compulsions, that their anxiety will go up and up and up and up and up and up and up. So that's their real fear. What happens is if you go past your stage where you do your compulsions, your anxiety will go up. And it'll go up a bit more, but then it will reach the stage where it won't go any higher. It will plateau. And then, over time, even if you do nothing else, the anxiety will start to drop back. So, this is what naturally happens. But for somebody with OCD, they keep trapped in this little triangle here. And they never learn that if they don't do anything, their anxiety is going to come down anyway. So I often share this with young people as a way of explaining what we're going to be doing. We're going to help you discover what happens if you don't do your compulsions. Is your anxiety going to go up here? Or, as I'm sort of predicting, it will go up and then you'll notice it starting to go down again. That's the classic exposure sort of process. So, you've got two different messages which are happening in this diagram. First one is very clearly what we know, and we want to highlight, is that your compulsive behaviours only bring temporary relief. Because you're trapped. And no matter what you do, it will keep happening. So it doesn't change things. And the second piece of learning is that even if you do nothing, your anxiety over time is going to change. And that's what we're going to help you to discover. So it's two very simple messages. So in each of these stages, I really want to get across simple but important messages. So that's what we're doing. It's not complicated. We don't want to go into a great deal of explanation. We want to try and make it simple and understandable. Okay, if we can switch into presentation part 2, please. Thank you. So, if we now look here, the bits which we have covered so far, we've done the psychoeducation, we've done the understanding of anxiety. The third section we're going to look at now is this bit about cognitive enhancement. Changing the meanings of the thoughts which I am having, which are driving my compulsive behaviours. So, the whole idea here during this stage is to help the young person to test and challenge the meaning of some of the assumptions they have that are creating and maintaining the OCD. I'm a bad person, something bad will happen to people I love. Those sorts of thoughts which are driving the OCD. Because I love somebody, I must keep them safe. Because I have these thoughts, it means I'm going to act on them, but you're not. So, as I said in the first part, the sort of 3 bits which we're particularly interested with OCD are these ideas about personal responsibility for harm. When you talk to somebody with OCD, they are completely convinced that they are responsible for keeping people safe and for any harm that might happen to them. There's no other explanation. It's all down to me. The severity of the harm which might happen is dreadful. Very severe. People dying, people having car crashes, people catching horrible diseases and dying. It's all about death and its very severe consequences. And this idea of thought-action fusion, where the thoughts in their heads, because I think it means it's going to happen, become cemented, glued together. And having the thought is almost as bad as it happening, because you're assuming it will happen. So, this idea of personal responsibility, it's something which Paul Sarkoskis basically identified. And it's the belief that one has this power, which is absolutely central to bring about or prevent negative outcomes. So you're a very powerful person all of a sudden. And in terms of the expectations and consequences which will happen, people with OCD tend to overestimate the likelihood that bad things will happen, but also the severity of the consequences which will happen as well. So it is going to happen, definitely going to happen. It will happen today, if not today, tomorrow, and it will be absolutely severe. And the thought-action fusion, we've already discussed, is this sense that having this thought increases the likelihood that it's going to come true. Common thought-action fusion, which you might come across in your work, is the idea about moral concerns. If I have bad thoughts, then I am a bad person. If I have thoughts about gay people, then it means I am a gay person. These are the sort of connections which people start to make. Increasing the probability, if I had aggressive thoughts towards somebody, I will severely hurt them. If I have thoughts that I like my sister, I might sexually rape her. This is the way the thought gets transmitted in this thought-action fusion. So as you can see, the consequences are so bad that the young person is petrified that unless they do their habits, this is going to happen. That's why OCD is so powerful. So let's just see if we can play this video of Russell talking about his, talking about the way he was thinking. I think videos today are bad news.
Yeah, it's my fault, things have gone wrong.
Yeah. Now, when we talked about this, you've already sort of mentioned it a little bit, that the sort of thing which you thought were going to happen was that something bad was going to happen to Dad.
Yeah, because of me.
Because of you.
Yeah.
Well, that's what you were really thinking, wasn't it?
Yeah.
That somehow you would be causing Dad to become seriously ill.
Yeah. Yeah.
And do you remember what you were sort of thinking might happen to Dad?
Yeah, because of the heart attacks, and that was mainly what I was focusing on.
And again, those sort of thoughts that you were having, that's a very, very upsetting thought to think that Dad could have a heart attack unless I do certain things. That's a scary thought.
Yeah, extremely. Extremely. And that's why these obsessive behaviours were so important, because I could never get around the fact that if I did miss one out, something was definitely going to go wrong. I never questioned that nothing was.
You know, it's really interesting. I'm sorry if you couldn't understand everything which was said there, but some of the comments from Russell when we were talking highlighted some of these sorts of themes which are common with OCD. So this idea about personal responsibility. I asked him about whether anything bad would happen, and he said, yes, something bad would happen to Dad because of me. Totally certain that if anything bad happened to Dad, it was him. The severity of this, because I asked him, well, okay then, so what might happen to Dad? He said, Dad would have a heart attack and die. So not just that Dad might trip over or bang his head, he's going to have a heart attack and die. So we have these inflated expectations of seriousness. And the total certainty that he had in his mind, something would definitely go wrong. No question about it. It would definitely happen if he didn't do his habits. So these are some of the ways for thinking which you see in OCD, where the thoughts, the personal responsibility, the expectations are very severe, and the likelihood of it happening are definitely going to be. This is the things to watch out for in your conversations with people, because these will be some of the things we will test at a later stage. So, just really wanted to show that to you so that during the course of your clinical discussions with people, just keep listening for some of these very subtle statements which they make, which might be about responsibility, which might be about severity, which might be about certainty, because these are going to be things which you might want to work with during your treatment. Now, what do we do? Well, one of the things which we're wanting to try to do is to introduce new information, new meaning, which might help Russell and others to start to develop an alternative way of thinking about things. So one of the things which we do for this issue of personal responsibility, which can be very helpful, is to use a pie chart. And I'll do this in a minute. Because it's a very powerful visual way of allocating responsibility, which shows that there's different reasons things might happen other than down to you. So for Russell, definitely me, well, there might be alternatives. So this is a pie chart which we constructed for Joshua. And Joshua was 100% absolutely certain that he was going to be responsible for his mother contacting COVID unless he washed his hands. Very much like Russell, excuse me, totally certain that his mother was going to be infected by him. So we constructed a pie chart. And the way that you do this is by starting with the child's belief that we want to test. So, in this instance, with Joshua, what he was telling me is that if I don't wash my hands enough, Mum is going to catch COVID. That's his belief, that's his assumption. Then what we do is to just stop and think, what might be some of the other possible reasons why people catch COVID? So we have a general discussion. We take it away from Mum to have a general discussion. So it could be somebody coughing on Mum. Mum not wearing a face mask. This was during COVID, as you might have picked up. Mum not wearing her mask. Mum sitting near an infected person on the bus as she goes into town. Mum touching a door handle in public place, in the office where she worked. And we could have gone on, but we just really want to pick out a few different reasons. And then what we do is we assign each of these different reasons a slice of our responsibility pie. So, this is what it looked like. So we decided that we're going to put them all together, and as you can see over in this corner here, but we've got Russell feeling that he's not washing his hands enough. So that's a big slice of the pie. So if you look at it, it is the biggest reason in this pie. But it's not 100%, because somebody coughing on Mum, Mum not wearing a mask, all these other reasons suddenly appear as possible explanations for Mum developing COVID. So what we had done is, by doing a visual pie chart like this, challenged the belief of Joshua that he would be 100% responsible for Mum catching COVID if he didn't wash his hands, to 33%. Now, it doesn't mean that he's now changed. He still has that worry. But what we're doing is trying to introduce new meaning, new information, which over time is going to put more and more leverage into him changing and challenging that belief. So pie charts are very, very powerful visual techniques for challenging that 100%. The other thing we want to do is to help children to test the connection which they have assumed between the way they think and what is happening. So this is about testing logical inferences, is what we call it. So what happens here
is that we're wanting to try to develop an alternative explanation for things. This is what we're doing all the time in CBT, and particularly with OCD, to develop an alternative explanation about why these things are happening. So, depends on how you want to do this, but we might say that there may be two possible explanations here. One might be what we could call theory A, which is that your OCD is really about preventing danger. So what that means is you're right. Bad things are definitely going to happen unless you do your habits. So that's a possibility. But it's theory B here as well. But perhaps OCD is about worry. That you worry that bad things will happen, which is different to theory A, which is bad things will definitely happen. Theory B is about worry. So we're introducing a different explanation. And one of the ways which we can do this, testing this link between thoughts and behaviours, is by looking at what I call the chain of events. So what we will do, and we'll do this in a minute, is to look at all the steps which would have to happen for this worry to actually result in the feared consequence. So in this example, Marla was a girl who was 12, who I worked with, who had multiple obsessive behaviours, and these were all about contamination. And the contamination she worried about was that she would infect her mother with germs and that her mother would die. She engaged in numerous obsessive behaviours, hand washing, constantly changing her clothes, not touching door handles, using the same crockery and cutlery so that her mother wouldn't use anything that she had touched. There were multiple habits. But we decided to just check one. And we decided to look at door handles. This idea that I will pass germs to my mother through the door handle if I touched it. We did a chain of events, and it looked like this. So for this to happen, we sat down together with just lots of bits of paper, and we started to work out various bits of our link. So as you can see, what we've done is constructed a chain, because all these have to happen to get down to the feared consequence at the end, that the person, in this case her mother, would die. So it starts up at the top here. So you're worried about germs and passing those through touching a door handle. So what's the first step? Well, you've actually got to be ill to start with to have the germs to pass onto the door handle. Okay, what's next? Well, the germs have then got to be on the door handle, and they've got to get there from your hand to the door handle. So somehow there has to be a process of transmission. So you've got germs inside you, they need to come out onto your hands, onto the door handles. They need to stay alive on the door handle until the next person comes along and touches it. Then the germs must be picked up by the other person. Somehow they've got to get inside their body. Somehow the body's defenses won't be able to work and defend themselves. Somehow the person's going to become very ill. Somehow the treatments aren't going to work. Somehow this is going to become more and more and more serious, resulting in them dying. So there's many steps going on here, which have to be in place for that outcome to follow from that thought.
And as you can see, any one of these steps, if they're not there, the chain is broken and the feared outcome of death will not happen. So it is a process of helping the child, young person, to really look at, is this really the case? I have this worry, that's the feared outcome. What has to happen for that to really occur? And it starts to get them to challenge it. And again, what we're doing all the time is building up a different understanding. It's all we're wanting to do, to expose somebody to OCD with a different understanding which helps to reduce the power of the thinking they had at the start. The other way we can test logical inferences is to actually find out, well, are bad things going to happen if you don't actually undertake your compulsive behaviors? Now, this is harder because you would be asking somebody to stop doing something and they are already completely convinced that if they do, bad things are going to happen. But there are opportunities. And this is an example of something which happened with Russell, the boy who I showed in some of the earlier videos. And it's something which happened, we didn't plan it, it happened, and he came and he talked about it, and we were able to use it as a way of perhaps highlighting how his habits didn't have the power or weren't keeping things as safe as he would like. Now, what happened was that Russell was a football fan. He followed Manchester United. And what he did was that he engaged in lots of his habits when they were playing football. And he'd do all his straightening and counting and all sorts of things. And the idea here was that if he did all these, he'd keep his team safe. They wouldn't lose the match. They would win. And what happened was that Manchester United were playing this important game in a European football final. And whilst watching this match, Russell was going crazy with all his sort of obsessive habits, doing everything as much as he could. And what happened was that Manchester United were losing 3-0, and there was 5 minutes of the game left. He got frustrated by this. He basically gave up and stopped doing his habits. And I suppose what the learning was here was that doing all these habits hasn't kept his football team safe and winning at all. Now, the magical bit happened next. He stopped, and Manchester United scored 4 goals in the last 5 minutes to win this game. So all of a sudden, he stopped his habits, his favourite team came through, won the game. And it was a really helpful way of reflecting with Russell about, so you do your habits and the team won, but when you don't do your habits, you do your habits and your team was losing, you stop your habits and the team win. So do your habits really make good things happen? And it's really powerful. It was a natural experiment. We couldn't have planned it, but it is just one of those good opportunities that when things happen like this, use them to highlight the connection between thoughts and behaviors and raise uncertainty about whether in fact that happens. Now, logical inferences can be quite powerful, but they can also be a fairly sort of detached process. So I could go through that big chain of events with some children, and
highlight all the different steps for the bad things to happen. But for some children, they turn around and say, yeah, but I know, but it still could happen. So a logical inference approach like that would not work. We would be looking at using another method, another technique, perhaps a behavioral experiment to explore this in a different way. And it can also be quite difficult for younger children who might have more limited cognitive understanding. So it's about trying to find a fit between the method and what is going to work for your particular child. It can be very powerful. So I talked about behavioral experiments, and I think that you all know that one of the most important things which we do in CBT is that we don't talk and bring about change that way. We basically say, let's test it out. Let's find out what happens. Let's do an experiment, and you tell me whether what you expected has actually happened. So behavioral experiments we use a lot with children with OCD. Now, when we're doing this, quite often, not always, but quite often, we will devise experiments which will test specific cognitions, beliefs, or assumptions. So we'll take one of the key thoughts which the child has and think about how we might be able to test them. The beauty of an experiment is that it's not talking hypothetically about what might happen. We test out and find out what actually happens. And the idea here again is to help the child to discover new information. So, I'm going to show you a video, I hope, of me in a treatment session with a young girl, Maddie. Say a young girl, Maddie was 17. She, I think, has had the most severe OCD I have ever worked with. All her OCD is related to concerns about personal safety. And it's about thoughts about catching germs, and that she will catch germs and she will die. She had so many compulsive behaviors, it was impossible to sort of keep track of them all. She had all sorts of different things she would do, balancing rituals, number things, hand washing, only using certain plates and utensils. And she would spend 5-6 hours at least each day wrapped up in her rituals. It became so bad that we were considering at one time whether we needed to admit her to hospital. She was spending 3 hours each night doing all her habits to eat 3 mouthfuls of food, so we were really very, very concerned about her. We did engage in therapy, like we've been talking about, and really pleased that Maddie started to shift. She started to improve. Now, what I'm going to do is show you this video, which might sound a bit odd to you. My aim was to get Maddie to keep questioning the relationship between what she does and her thoughts. Now, the way I was going to do this was I was going to make fun. We're going to have a game. So what I did was I decided that I was going to use some of these. I don't know what you call them in Turkey. We call them glass marbles. So little glass balls, children play with them, but we just had a big bag of glass marbles. So I decided that I was going to have a bag of marbles,
which we're going to represent Maddie's habits. And in this session, I just start throwing these marbles around, like she's doing her habits. What I then did is I just kept doing it until Maddie said, "What are you doing? Why are you throwing those marbles around?" And then I introduced the idea that the reason I was doing this was because I thought that throwing these around would keep us safe. So very much what we know, that you have a thought, you do the habit, and the habit keeps people safe. She said, "Well, what's it going to keep us safe from?" And I says, "From snakes." So something completely random. This is our clinic session in a hospital. She said, "Oh, snakes?" So the marbles were the thoughts, were the habits, and the worry I had was that snakes would come and get us. Now, what happened is that Maddie starts to challenge me. She starts to say, "What? Throwing marbles around is going to stop snakes coming in here." And what she's doing, and then we reflect on it, is, well, isn't that what you do? That you do your habits, marbles, to stop and keep people safe, snakes. So she has started to question her own assumptions through me playing this little game with her, which is basically highlighting the link between doing something and thinking it will stop something bad happening. So I will show you this video, hopefully, and it will just give you an idea. And again, part of what I think we do in CBT is to try to find fun, engaging ways of helping children to see alternative ways of thinking. So when we do this, and can we turn the volume up on this one, please, now? Because it's quite quiet. But here we go. I hope it plays.
Why are you chucking marbles everywhere?
I wanted to do this before you came in, because I quite often do this. What I do is I sort of go around the room and I sort of put these around, because what I found, or what I think, is that it keeps the snakes away, really. If I put these around, it keeps the snakes.
The snakes?
Yeah.
But there aren't any snakes.
No, you've never seen any here, have you?
No.
Well, that's because I go around doing this.
Really? But why have you ever seen a snake in here before?
No, because these keep them away.
Right. Like, how do you know they're going to come? How do you know there's only snakes around here?
Well, I'm sure there are. It's occasion, sure there's snakes around.
Snakes and I've never seen one.
Have you not? But you've never seen one here, have you?
No, I haven't, no.
What?
I'd be a little bit scared if I had.
Well, that's right. So this really works.
Yeah, no, well, it does, definitely.
You don't look very convinced.
I'm not really. Well, I don't know. I suppose I'd have to see one to be convinced.
Well, it would have to go wrong almost. We'd have to get a snake in here for you to think that this needs to do something.
I know that a snake would have to come to the door and then go away again when it saw the marbles. Then I might believe it.
Right. Okay.
But I don't know if you can arrange that.
Well, I don't know if one can.
No, I don't think you can.
So it's quite hard to prove, isn't
Yeah,
it?
quite hard.
Because in a sense, I suppose, this is a bit like what you do, isn't it?
Yes. It can relate, yeah.
Because you do your habits to stop bad things happening or things going wrong.
Yeah, I do.
It's a bit like
Kind
me,
of similar.
isn't it?
Yeah, it's quite the same, really. I don't know, well, yeah, because sure whether it's keeping patterns right, but just in case,
And you weren't very convinced when I started throwing this around. You were saying, hey, what are you doing?
Yeah, I was. I was like, what are you doing? It's like, this sounds not very convincing.
No, but these were your habits. You might now have a couple of habits,
Yeah.
just in case. Oh, I've got lots of habits in my bag, you see.
Yeah, that's like as many as mine.
Another one, another habit.
Yeah.
Do another one, just to keep things away, make sure nothing ever happens.
Definitely.
Yeah, should we do it again?
Yeah.
Great.
Definitely.
There you are.
Perfect.
That's great.
That is
So there's loads of habits now.
lots of them, yeah.
We don't know their word, do we?
No, we don't, but...
Okay, I'm really sorry about that. I got the video jinx here today, so I'm sorry you didn't get their titles, but I hope my explanation at the beginning tried to set the scene, really, that me throwing those marbles around finally got her to say, what are you doing? And I basically said that these keep us safe. She then said, safe from what? And I made up the idea of snakes. She said, that is ridiculous. And then started to challenge me on it. And we then stopped, and I said, well, aren't these marbles like your habits? You've got no idea whether they keep us safe. And then she starts to challenge herself and say, no, well, I suppose it is like my habits, and I don't know for definite whether they work. So we're starting to raise uncertainty, starting to put a little bit of doubt that you need to do this, you need to do these habits, and start to break that link between the thoughts and the habits. But it's about finding a fun way to do it. And I had a very good relationship with Maddie. And she sort of, interestingly though, I sat here for about 10 minutes throwing these marbles around, and she didn't say anything for 10 minutes. And I thought, how long am I going to have to keep doing this before she says something? But she eventually did, which I'm delighted with. So, don't know where that was. So just generally, so that was an objective way, really, of engaging a young person to start to question what they're currently doing. But if you're going to do a behavioural experiment, I think that there's a variety of different steps to go through. The first one is to clearly identify the thought or belief that you want to test. What is the one which seems to be most important at the moment? Often the one which is most frequent or causing most distress. At the outset, once you've identified it, you get the young person to rate how strongly they believe it. Scale of 1 to 100. Don't go 1 to 10 because it's too small. Go 1 to 100 so that some of the small gradations can be important. You then work out how you can test this, when, where, how. Identify what the child's prediction is, so what's going to happen. Then do the experiment. You find out the outcome, you reflect on it, and then you re-rate the strength of belief in that. So here's a very simple one which we did about a young person called Ben who had this real OCD about contamination, which he was dealing with by compulsive hand washing. Washing his hands about 10, 12 times an hour. And he wasn't just washing them with soap and water. He was trying to introduce bleach to make sure that his hands were completely clean. So we identified the fault which was really causing all this. And the thought was that if he didn't wash his hands, people were going to become ill. He was going to infect them. Okay, that's fine.
How strongly did he believe it? Absolute certainty. And remember, coming back to the key cognitions with OCD, that certainty which they have, 100%, totally clear on this. So we talked a little bit and wondered about how we could test this. And I had a pack of biscuits I brought into this therapy session. So I talked with Ben and said, well, okay then, tell you what, can you just open that packet of biscuits for me, hand me one and I'm going to eat it? He was horrified, absolutely horrified. I said, well, okay, well, why are you so worried? He said, well, you're going to become ill, aren't you? I'll just go and wash my hands. No, I'm not going to wash your hands. I want you to give me a biscuit. So he gave me a biscuit. Very, very hard to get him to give me a biscuit. I had to coax him and encourage him. And he was very sort of tentatively not trying to touch the biscuit too much. I deliberately dropped it on the floor as well. And then I sat there and ate it. He was sort of, wide-eyed staring at me. And I said, okay, that's great. See you next week. And off he went. When he came back next week, of course I was all right. I was perfectly okay, nothing had happened. And what we were starting to do was to say, well, you didn't wash your hands, you gave me a biscuit, and you actually didn't infect me, did you? No, I didn't. So how much do you believe this original belief? Gone down slightly, but it's a very powerful belief. It had started to go down and shed some uncertainty in his mind. Definitely is now starting to be questioned. So again, what we're doing all the time is looking at ways in which we can test these relationships, bring new information, and bring new meanings into situations. So that's what we try and do during the cognitive enhancement phase. It is all about trying to reduce certainty which these young people have in their thoughts, trying to introduce new meanings, and breaking the link between the thought and the compulsive behaviors. And as you can see, you can do it in fun ways. Visual ways with the pie charts. You can do it breaking the chain, drawing one of those out. You can throw your marbles around in sessions or play games. You can get biscuits and eat them. You can do all sorts of things. But it just is an experiment which is a concrete way of talking about OCD. So the next part of our intervention is about the family. And as we looked at this earlier, family accommodation is very important in terms of maintaining the child's OCD. And what we want to do during this phase is to change any family patterns that might be contributing to the maintenance of the OCD. So, when we talked about accommodation, if you remember, different ways this can happen. They can actually participate in their child's compulsive behaviors. This can happen in many ways. You get engaged in the child routine, you modify your own family routines. So many families I meet who say, we don't go and do this anymore, what we do is this instead. Providing reassurance, avoiding triggers, you can do it in lots of different ways. But do remember that whatever parents are doing, they might be reinforcing the child's OCD, encouraging it, and preventing the child from learning that actually they can do things differently.
I think it's also really important to understand that why parents do this is that they believe they are helping their child. That's what they believe. They also will be very clear that if we do it, it stops our child from becoming too upset, too distressed. It also makes life easier. But if you know going somewhere is going to trigger your child and they're going to become very upset, it's actually easier not to have to deal with that. And sometimes it could feel quite quick and easy just to say, it's going to be okay, it's going to be okay, so it's going to be okay, let's go out. So I think that parents are doing these things to help their child. But what is happening is the reverse is going on. That actually their behaviours are maintaining and strengthening the child's OCD. So during this phase, what we want to do is that we want to start to develop a partnership between parent and child. We want to reduce any sort of conflict and blame. So we want to change that attitude of parent thinking he's just being difficult, he wants to upset family life, to your child is struggling to deal with their worries. I want to challenge parental's beliefs about accommodation. Okay, so you think that you're being helpful. Let me ask a few questions, and I'm going to give you 4 in a minute to reflect on. We want to stop them directly engaging in any of their child's OCDs, and we want the family to get on with the life that they would like rather than always working around their child. So, what are we going to do? This is something which we talked about earlier when we were looking at John March, how I ran OCD off my land and how we want to separate OCD from the child. And with younger children, I think it's really quite simple. You get them to draw their OCD, give it a name, and that is what parents and child do battle with. So with younger children, they love doing this. They come up with many sort of different sort of drawings of what their OCD might look like, and that then becomes the OCD who we're going to battle with. We're going to beat OCD now. So the child has their name, parents work with them, and it's this nasty OCD they're going to do battle with. So we're trying to take OCD away from the child. Challenging parental beliefs about accommodation is key. But I'm not going to criticize parents for what they're doing. They're doing this because they think it's helpful. But I'm going to ask them some questions which might start them to question whether in fact this is helpful. And there's 4 simple questions I really want to sort of raise with you, which I use quite regularly and I think are really useful. So the first one is about parents telling me that if we do this, it's really helpful, you know. Okay, so what do you mean? He says, well, you know, they stop their distress fairly quickly. My question, though, is, okay, if it's helpful, why does your child keep becoming distressed? Why do they keep engaging in their habits? Because if it's helpful, surely they shouldn't be becoming distressed and they shouldn't be doing this. So I will be having a conversation with them about, so you say it's helpful, well, okay, so let me know, so why do they keep doing this if it's helpful? Accommodation, it makes life easier if we just do these things. Okay, but how does this actually help your child to engage with everyday life, learn that they can cope? Because all you're doing is keeping them at home. They're not having opportunities to go out. So I'm starting to sort of broaden out the parents' thinking to consider other options. But yeah, you know, this accommodation, it does make it easier for us. You got any other children? How does this affect them, do you think? Does it make it easier for them? Because quite often you find that brothers and siblings have to basically do what the child with OCD wants or feels they can do. And so they suffer, they lose out. Sometimes parents themselves say that they lose out and they themselves cannot do the stuff they want. So parents can't go out because the child is worried that if they go out, something terrible will happen. So they stay at home. And perhaps parents might come back and say something like, you know, well, look, you know, we only just say it's going to be okay. It's very simple, very quick. Okay. So how many times do you reckon you'd say that in a day? Ooh, I don't know, 30, 40, 50. But if you're constantly saying it's going to be okay to your child, what message does it send? The message is that I'm telling you it's okay, that your bad thoughts aren't going to come true. I don't actually need to do that because your thoughts are random thoughts which have got no reality whatsoever, so I don't need to do it. So I think that what I'm trying to show you here is that conversations with parents will be questioning in a curious way. So I always think that whenever I engage in this, that I have curious questions. That's interesting. Tell me more. And I want to sort of really get parents to help me to explain how it's helpful, how it makes life easier, how it's beneficial for other people in the family. It might be simple, but how does that help in the long term? Getting parents to think and reflect on their behavior so that they can then change it. Something else which we said we want to do here is to actually stop parents engaging in their child's OCD. And this is really important because it continues this message of helping the child discover that their compulsive behaviors are unnecessary. They don't need to do them. What parents can do is to help their child cope, reclaim family life, and basically get on with life again. So I'm just going to show you this really, which is about family accommodation and avoidance. And this was something which we did with a young lad called Jake. So Jake was 14. He had lots and lots of thoughts about his parents' safety. And he really believed that his parents were going to be seriously hurt unless he obsessively checked that they were okay. And this did stem from an accident. Mum was out one day in the car. She came back late. She had an accident. It was a minor accident, minor shunt. But this lad then started to worry about Mum and that something more serious would happen. For the parents, it's easier for them to stay at home. But 6 months later, they were beginning to see that actually it's not all right for us to stay at home. We want to go out. And they started to resent having to stay at home. So we discussed about the need for them that if that's the life they want and go out, go out. And what we need to do is to help Jake learn to cope with that. So we sat down together and we made a plan. So his parents decided they'd quite like to go out. They hadn't been out for months now. And they were going to go out for a meal, for a pizza. So we talked with Jake that they're going to go out. They're going to go and have a pizza. We didn't talk about if Mum and Dad went out, if they decided to do this. We talked with certainty. Mum and Dad are going to go out. They're going to go and have a pizza.
They decided that they will go on Wednesday night. They'll probably go out about 7, and they will be back at 9. What do you think? Jake, of course. Well, are they going to be safe? Are they going to be all right, etc., etc.? And what we did is that we tried to make this easy for Jake. So the pizza place was within walking distance. So the first time that they did this, Jake had worries about cars and accidents and things like that happening. His parents were going to walk to the pizza place. So that dealt with some of those. They could still get knocked over. Cars could still knock them over on traffic light, on pedestrian crossings. But we basically said that mum and dad would be very careful, that they were going to go and they were going to go out. What are you going to do when mum and dad go out? So we worked out with Jake what he would do. So instead of constantly texting, which is what he did, he used to text his parents if they did go out regularly, many, many times a day. We decided we'd get him a film, put his favourite film on so he could sit and watch that. Mum would say goodbye and off they went. We also said to Jake that mum and dad aren't taking their phones with them. So you can't contact them. No point in texting. And they'll be back in 2 hours and see you then. So, we set the experiment up with certainty. It's definitely happening. Not maybe, it's definitely. We also talked with the parents how they would be able to support each other. Because for them, this was hard. They knew that Jake might well become upset. But they had to support each other, focus on the meal, deal with the here and now. They had the meal, they came back, and lo and behold, was very pleased to see them. But he had dealt with 2 hours of his parents being out. Parents had had their meal, and lo and behold, he didn't need his parents to be with him in the room all the time to keep safe. We'd started to break the OCD connections. So, how you can do it, very simple, small steps. Very, very powerful. So really what we're talking about here when we're dealing with family accommodation is that we want to give parents permission to do things differently, to really reflect on what they're doing, to adopt a no-blame approach. Acknowledge it's going to be tough. What you're doing at the moment, is it really working or not? And remember that you're doing these things because you care about your child and you want to help them. What you have been doing may not be as helpful as what you're going to try to do now. So that's family accommodation and how we empower parents to do things differently. Finally, exposure. Now, what I often find in a lot of the work I do is that when we've gone through those previous steps, we often don't need to do very much of this because we've been doing it gently as we've been going through some of the other steps. So we've already started to introduce different meanings, different explanations, understanding the anxiety build-up, understand the connection between thoughts, distress, and behaviours, and we started to break that down. But when you're actually doing exposure, keep coming back to the rationale about why we're doing it. And this is just so important for people to get what we're doing. And it's this line up here that if you don't do habits, don't worry, your anxiety is not going to go up and up and up and up. It's going to peak. Then it's going to come down. But you need to find that out. So, if you're going to do exposure, I'm sure a lot of you know this, so my intention is not to spend too long here. You make a fear hierarchy. So you look at all
all the different things a person might be worried about. I'll show you one in a minute. And you then arrange them in the most difficult to the easiest to do. Have as many steps as you want, but do not make each step too big. The reason is that if the steps are small, there is a greater likelihood of success than a big step and the child failing. Because if the child fails, all you're doing is reinforcing, I can't do this, I knew it's really important for me to do these habits. So, this was a sort of hierarchy which we developed with a young girl who had lots of sort of contamination fears. Worst one for her was about going to the toilet in a public place. For her, all the loos were going to be infected, and it was something she was avoiding at all costs. So we came up with lots of situations here, and we started with the one which she felt was worrying, but less so for her at the moment. And this was about whether she could touch the waste bin in the kitchen with a pair of rubber gloves on. Could. We went on to the next. Touching that bin without gloves on. Yeah, she did that, which is really good. And then wondering about whether she could touch objects in other people's houses, because she didn't touch things. She would go in the door, so she'd stand there, somebody opened the door and she'd come on in. She wouldn't go anywhere unless somebody opened the next door and then showed her through. She wouldn't sit down on anything, and so she would just avoid doing all these things. So we then got her to start to touch things. So as you can see, it's small steps, but these steps all lead us up the ladder to the ultimate one of feeling comfortable with those very difficult situations she first identified. Exposure, as I said in the first part, is really difficult for therapists. I meet so many people who talk about exposure but never do it. Because it's distressing. You're having to contain and manage a child who is going to become anxious. That's why you need to give this clear rationale about why we are doing it. It's to help you. It's to help you learn that you can beat your OCD and to stop it from bossing you around. We're going to help you to learn to tolerate anxiety and to find that it's going to come down without any of your habits whatsoever. So that's it. That's the rationale. And I will repeat that and repeat that and repeat that and repeat that so that it's very, very clear what is happening. I think we have to be very, very honest. And I'm always very honest with children. They say, but, you know, I'm going to get really upset. I said, you might. Yeah, I think you might. But I also think that you are going to overcome that, and you're going to be then very pleased with yourself for having tried to do this. Make sure you've got enough time when you do an exposure task. I don't know how you work here in Turkey. In the UK, we tend to work on an hourly basis with appointments. I think quite often you need more than an hour. I think you need a bit of time with the child at the beginning, child with time at the end. And we often will use what we call these SUDs, subjective units of distress, which is just a fancy name for saying rate 1 to 100 how you're feeling in terms of anxiety. And we will constantly be asking the child to rate how anxious they are, to rate how anxious they are, to give us a number of their feelings. Because for exposure to be successful, the SUDs will go up, they will then peak, and we've got to stay with it until they start to come down. Because I'm telling them that your anxiety is going to go up and that it will then come down. So we're going to stay there until that happens. And it will come down. You might need a longer session. You can do it
imaginal. You can imagine situations, but the most powerful way of doing it, obviously, is in real life. And it's, if you ever have the opportunity to do exposure in real life, it can be absolutely an amazing, powerful experience. So the key message here, be honest. I'm not going to trick you. I'm not going to tell you that it's all going to be easy. You are going to get upset. But you get upset anyway. I'm going to assure the child that they're in control. That's why we spend a lot of time planning what we're going to do. You tell me whether you think you can do it. How are you going to deal with it? How do you think we could help you to deal with that? So we put them in control. I'm not suddenly going to sort of spring something on them. And again, I have to reassure parents quite a lot that the child's going to be okay. And they're helping. So sometimes it's easier to do exposure without parents because parents get very anxious and they're very keen to jump in and say, are you sure this is all right? Sometimes it's much easier to do it without parents there. So, that is a quick guide tour through the blended approach which we will be using for OCD. Psychoeducation, that involves your formulation. Anxiety management, where it's anxiety awareness, understanding what happens with anxiety so that you can then do something about that. Let's see if we can develop new meanings to the normal thoughts that you are having. Let's look at how the family can help you in a helpful way. And if necessary, let's test it out. Let's do some experiments and show you that you can learn to beat your OCD. So I hope that's been helpful. I hope it's given you some ideas. I hope that you can put some of those into practice. OCD is quite difficult, because of the power of the thoughts. It's not quick, but I think that keep hanging on to the idea that what you're wanting to do is break that link between thoughts and behaviors, to challenge the meanings that the child has about those thoughts, and to do it in some sort of fairly concrete ways. And that, I think, can be really, really helpful. So I'm going to stop there. And I think we have a few minutes left.
We do. Thank you very much.